It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. When they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Lieutenant Governor's Suite at Queen's Park. My name is Sarah Truscott, and I'm the Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff and Private Secretary, and I will be serving as your Master of Ceremonies tonight. Before we begin, a gentle reminder to please turn your phones to silent or vibrate. However, please feel free to tweet, post, and share your experience here tonight. Please also note that this event is being recorded, and we ask that you please keep the center aisle clear during the panel discussion. We're so pleased that you've joined us to kick off a series of events that celebrate the upcoming coronation of His Majesty King Charles III. Our office is very proud to partner this evening with the Empire Club of Canada to present For King and Canada. The event title reflects what we will be discussing tonight, the ties that bind the Canadian Crown and the Canadian people. Of these many bonds, none are more important than the sacred treaty relationships between the Crown and the First Peoples of this land. We recognize Toronto as a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. In this space, the treaty relationships between the Crown and Indigenous peoples are deeply valued, and we acknowledge Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Indeed, there is much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of those who have been stewards of this land for generations. And now, as is customary, for those who are able, please rise and join me in welcoming our host for this evening, the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And please remain standing for the playing of the Vice-Regal Salute. Please be seated. The highlight of our evening will be a panel discussion exploring the different facets of the Crown in Canada and the impact of the coronation. You'll be introduced shortly to the members of the panel. You will also have an opportunity tonight to hear from the Lieutenant Governor and our partners at the Empire Club. Following the panel, the Lieutenant Governor invites all of you to join us on the first floor for dinner. As mentioned, this part of the evening is being recorded and will be available tomorrow for viewing on the Empire Club's website. To help us start in a good way, I would like to invite Dr. Vern Ross, a traditional knowledge keeper from the Cote First Nation in Saskatchewan and an assistant professor at the Centre for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto, to please come forward and offer an opening blessing. Dr. Ross.
When I was asked to come and speak at this wonderful gathering, they said I only had 5 minutes. And I was thinking, how would I actually begin doing this within 5 minutes? Well, it's not easy, for one, but I'll do my best for all of us here. Anin tanse, sego, bojo. My name is Vern Ross, and I also go by my Anishinaabe name, Minugishigad Ginwaji Binishi, which means nice day, nice bird. Good evening, everyone, and what a pleasure it is to be here with you all. I want to say Chimi Gwich to our Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, the Honorable Elizabeth Downwell, for the invite. I was so excited when I was getting this invitation to do the blessing. For the King and for our country, Canada, our beautiful, precious country. An evening to honor the coronation of His Majesty, King Charles III. First Nations people have a relationship with the Crown. I want to say Chimi Gwich to Nokomis, our grandmother, and our Misomis, our grandfather, who sit in the 4 directions looking over us all here. We thank you for all your teachings, the guidance, and knowledge that we so cherish and value. As we gather here this evening, we ask for your strength to help us work together in a good way. As we hear and listen to the voices and the stories, the discussions that are about to be shared, let us give recognition to hear and to listen to our voices and stories so we can become the story and make it a part of our lives. It is those stories that are part of healing. Let us not forget that. Nokomis grandmother and Mishomis grandfather remind us to be kind to each other and most importantly to help each other out when we are encountering challenges out there in the world or wherever we are. As I raise my sacred feather and hold the sacred tobacco, which is one of our 4 sacred medicines, it helps to bring people together for us to work in a positive way. Here is my spiritual blessing to you all, and especially to the King, His Majesty King Charles III. And last and foremost, we give thanks to this beautiful, precious land that we live on. So I want to say Chimi Gwich to you all, Chimi Gwich to all the children, and Chimi Gwich to our elders, to our seniors, And I want to say Chimigwech to all the youth that are out there. We have to teach our youth. And that is why I become a professor. To teach who are the First Nations people in Canada. And when I lay down the tobacco later, this is all for yous. Chimigwech, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross. It is now my pleasure to invite the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, to provide welcoming remarks. Your Honour.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Mr. Rabini, panelists, distinguished guests, friends, longtime friends, mes chers amis, welcome, bienvenue, and bonjour. Pardon me. How very happy we are to have you in this space, in this historic space. This is the home of the Crown in Ontario. And very happy that we're able to share this conversation virtually with so many others in the coming days. Thank you so much to the Empire Club of Canada for being our partner in this event. Over the years, the informed and respectful dialogue that your club has fostered has been illuminating. Pardon me. And in advance, I want to thank the panelists, Ms. Hiscox, Ms. Harris, Mr. Maraj, and Mr. Tidrich, for sharing your insights and your experience. It gives me great pleasure always to convene people in respectful and genuine dialogue about the future of communities, about understanding each other, and indeed, without being presumptuous, about the very future of humanity. Today, we're going to have a conversation about continuity and change. The forthcoming coronation presents us with a unique opportunity as we gather together to celebrate, to also take advantage of this moment to learn and question the potential of this institution, the Crown, in a fast-paced, interconnected world of global challenge. How can this institution help us move forward in a better way? That's why I'm delighted that this is one of our events to focus on young people, and I'm delighted to see so many of you in the audience tonight. Your investment, your engagement, your enthusiasm, and your fresh ideas leave me with no doubt that Canada will benefit greatly from your leadership in the coming years. How remarkable it is that for 70 years, our late sovereign, the Queen, was such a reliable and steadfast presence in our lives. She was with us from the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, through the adoption of our new flag, to the advent of the Constitution, which she herself signed into law. She offered her calmness and commitment through conflict, crises, and COVID-19. Her unwavering service represented continuity and inspired us all in times of change. And notwithstanding a very different set of world circumstances, that, I think, will continue with His Majesty the King. His strong relationship with Ontarians and Canadians stretches from his very first visit in 1971 as a young prince, through his military training as a pilot in New Brunswick, to the Platinum Jubilee just last year. He's spoken thoughtfully about our nation. In 1991 at Queen's University in Kingston, he addressed what were then some very stark constitutional issues. He expressed the hope that Canadians might find, and I quote, a satisfactory and mutually acceptable way forward as members of a federation which remains the envy of much of the world and holds out the prospect of a great future built upon a most distinguished past. And even during his recent visit, he returned to this theme. He called Canada, and again I quote, a model of determination and humanity in an era where the global institutions of democracy look distressingly fragile. His mother's reign was central to our maintaining our stability as a constitutional monarchy, and so too will his own reign. Crucial to this will be his ongoing dialogue with Indigenous leaders about the Crown's role in reconciliation. His Majesty clearly recognizes the importance of nurturing the spirit of kinship in which the treaties were signed. Reconciliation is vital to building this great future, as he has invoked. And traditionally and internationally, he's been prescient in his views on sustainability and resilience, seeking ways to ensure simultaneously economic prosperity, care for the environment, and social cohesion. He was ahead of many of us in understanding that. His Majesty has praised Canada as a great nation, populated by outward-looking, big-hearted people. So I hope we will do our best to live up to such high and affectionate praise. And with that hope and optimism, we now turn to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Before we turn to the panel, I would like to invite one last speaker, and that is Mr. Sal Rabani, President of the Empire Club of Canada, to please come forward and offer your remarks, and then we'll get to the panel. Thank you.
Your Honor, good evening, and welcome to the 119th season of the Empire Club of Canada. I'm honored to speak to you today as the President of the Board of Directors of the Empire Club of Canada, especially on such an auspicious occasion as the coronation of King Charles III at the Lieutenant Governor's Suite at Queen's Park. Our mandate at the Empire Club is to engage and advance the dialogue on what matters most to Canadians. To accomplish this, we must ask thoughtful questions, offer our insights, and lead discussions in public forums such as this one. Today's event honors the first coronation of a Canadian head of state and monarch in 7 decades. This is a significant moment in our history. It is an opportunity to reflect on the traditions, symbolism, and relevance, as well as the future of the Crown within our system of governance. For us as Canadians, it's also an opportunity to celebrate our multiculturalism and reaffirm the incredible diversity and inclusivity that makes our national fabric. For me personally, there is another important significance to this day. For me, a coronation signals, above all, a call to service, a commitment to serve and lead. It is a reminder of our collective responsibility. A call to service can take many forms. Not only queens and kings are bound to it, we are all bound to it. What can we do, each of us, to make Canada a better place? The world is changing rapidly. The dawn of the artificial intelligence era is upon us. Our society is more and more polarized, and we're facing the biggest existential threat of our lifetime, climate change. As Canadians, we stand proud of our heritage and our unique identity. It is up to all of us to use our skills and talents for the greater good, while staying true to the values and principles that make Canada a special place. This means embracing diversity, celebrating differences, and always striving to build bridges between communities. To the seasoned leaders we have with us today, thank you for your work and your service. You make Ontario a stronger and more prosperous province. And a special shout out, and this is near and dear to my heart, to the young leaders we have with us today. You are our country's future. Now you might ask yourself, what does service have to do with me? The truth is, and as you already know, you don't have to wait to be at the top to make a difference. Service can take many forms. It can be a job well done, a business or a startup well built, a product no one thought of, being a mentor to someone, doing a day of meaningful volunteering, being your best version of yourself in everything you do. This is service. One of my objectives is to extend the club's reach to include the new generation. We want to see more of you at our events. We want to hear from you, propose topics that you find relevant, and create meaningful networking opportunities as this one. You are the ones who will shape our society for generations to come, and it is up to you to decide what kind of Canada you want to create. At the Empire Club of Canada, we believe that it's only through meaningful conversations that we can move forward. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished guests on the tradition of the coronation, its significance and symbolism. And I invite all of you to use this historic event and today's discussions as a pretext to also think of tomorrow's Canada. Use it as a call to service for each of us to build together the best version of Canada we can. Turning to today's program, I'd like to recognize the Empire Club's Board of Directors, staff, past presidents, and the staff of the Lieutenant Governor's Office. Thank you for your contributions to making this event a success. And a special thanks to my fellow Board Director, Michael Kobzar, for championing this partnership. And of course, many thanks to Her Honor, the Honorable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, for hosting us. The Empire Club is a not-for-profit organization, and I'd like to thank all of our sponsors who are here today as well for making this event complimentary for our online viewers to attend. We're accepting questions from the audience for our speakers. You can do that by scanning the QR code found on the program booklet, and it is now my pleasure to introduce award-winning broadcaster Heather Hiscox, senior host of CBC News Network, who has covered many of the most significant events of our time, to moderate today's discussion and introduce our guest panelist. Heather, thank you.
Thank you, Sal, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Your Honor, for the invitation to be here and to share in this special event. What a rare privilege to be here in the Lieutenant Governor's suite and to see all around us here, and we had some private moments in the office a few minutes ago, the symbols of centuries. This is the very seat, as Her Honor was mentioning, the very seat of the monarchy in Ontario. And it is the perfect backdrop for our discussion tonight of the monarchy in Canada at a critical juncture in its history. Yesterday, on my morning news program, I showed some video of the royal superfans. You know who they are, you probably recognize them over the years. They're already in place, they're camping out in the Mall, they're jockeying for the best position so they can see what is to come on Saturday. And they told us they are beyond excited for the pageantry and the pomp the world has not glimpsed in 70 years. But yesterday, we also visited Wales, where young people there told us that kings and queens belong only in fairy tales now, and railed against the oppression and subjugation which they believe the crown embodies. Their words. So these are the competing voices we've been hearing and the debate we've been witnessing really since the death of the Queen back in September and the accession of her son as King Charles III, not just in the UK, but throughout the Commonwealth and indeed here in Canada. That dichotomy is the very thing into which we are going to delve over the next few minutes with the help of our three experts and panelists. Here's how we're going to begin. Each is going to offer some brief introductory remarks and explain his or her connection to the monarchy, and then they'll all be available to answer your questions. Sal was just explaining how to join in after our formal panel discussion, which is about 30 minutes long. Is that correct? Excellent. I want to make sure I'm to time. So please welcome, firstly, someone whom I have often had occasion to interview for royal events. She is an author, an expert in the history of European monarchy, and a royal commentator. This is Carolyn Harris.
Well, thank you very much for being here on the occasion of the coronation of King Charles III. In 1973, Queen Elizabeth II visited Bath Abbey for a special ceremony to mark the 1000th anniversary of the coronation of the Anglo-Saxon king Edgar the Peaceable, which had taken place at Bath Abbey in 973. Although coronations have changed and evolved over time, the basic service was laid down in 973 by St. Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that there would be the recognition, the oath, the anointing, the crowning, the homage, and also the recognition of the Queen Consort as well, which was a little controversial at that time, as Anglo-Saxon kings traditionally did not put their wives forward as Queen's Consort. Over the centuries, this coronation service has endured and developed through all sorts of political, religious, and social change. Coronations began to take place in Westminster Abbey in 1066, and there's the imagery in the Bayeux Tapestry of the last Anglo-Saxon monarch, Harold II, being crowned there in Westminster Abbey, and a riot at the coronation of William the Conqueror in 1066 led to the king panicking about his security and building the Tower of London. Going forward, various monarchs built on this ceremony to introduce aspects of their own goals and their own personalities. There were religious developments, the development of the Church of England during the reign of Henry VIII, and that title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England became very significant. The development of the constitutional monarchy from the late 17th century, but we also see all of these personal moments. And I think that's one of the reasons why coronations appeal to so many people around the world. As we have this historic ceremony, we have regalia that dates from the 17th century. The medieval regalia was melted down during the English Civil Wars, but we have the next best thing, the 17th century regalia and St. Edward's crown. And so amidst all of these historic objects, historic moments, are these personal touches over the years. George II, as a patron of George Frederick Handel, commissioned new coronation anthems, like Zadok the Priest, for instance. And we will see King Charles III also commissioning new coronation anthems, this time by Andrew Lloyd Webber instead of by George Frederick Handel. And we've seen the ceremony become more rehearsed over time. At Queen Victoria's coronation, there was not a rehearsal. And unfortunately, a number of things went wrong. Her ring was the wrong size. The Prime Minister was keeping his leftover snacks and bottles of wine in St. Edward's Chapel, and the Queen saw some of those sandwich wrappers there at that time in 1838. And one of the peers had difficulty mounting the steps and rolled down, from the throne. And unfortunately, he was named Lord Roll, so the press had a lot of fun with that. So going forward, the ceremonial became much more rehearsed and also rehearsed for a wider global audience. The introduction of photography, of film, and then in 1953 of television led to people around the world engaging with this ceremony. Many people in 1953 bought their very first television sets in order to watch the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And we have the first transatlantic television broadcast as the film footage was flown across the Atlantic to be shown on the CBC as quickly as possible. In 2023, there's a coronation emoji, #coronation, and a little St. Edward's crown appears, and we've seen members of the royal family updating their titles on social media. And all of these moments in the 21st century allow for a wider global audience in the Commonwealth, the wider world, as well as the United Kingdom, to share in the celebrations and have the opportunity to participate in a historic ceremony, but also to get to know the new monarch and what personal touches will be introduced within the context of the ceremony.
Do you feel that Her Honor invited anyone with just vague knowledge of this area of subject matter? I have no further questions. We can all leave now. I'm just kidding. Caroline, that's wonderful. I do want to make sure that we do do introduce the other two panelists, and I have questions for all of you. So Carolyn, just pause if you would for just a moment there. Beside Carolyn is someone who has dedicated himself to deepening our understanding of the complex relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. He's presently the Vice President of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada, the far end. Please welcome Nathan Tidridge. Good morning. Good morning. That's a habit, is it? Nathan, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. Just to give you an introduction to myself, my day job is a teacher. I'm a secondary school teacher in Hamilton, and I teach treaty studies and civics and world history, and the coronation really touches on all of those things. I've been interested in the Crown and writing about the Crown for as long as I can remember. And really in the past, I'd say 10, 15 years, I kept on coming up against relationships with Indigenous people. I'm a non-Indigenous person. And I realized then that this was something that I really needed to understand. And as you saw by the words that were offered at the beginning by both the Private Secretary, Her Honor, and then of course Dr. Ross, that relationship is there and part of it. And I think that it's a really important conversation that we should be having right now at the beginning of a new reign.
It is definitely part of our discussion to come. Thank you. And in the middle, his is a voice for peacemaking and for pluralism. He's a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and an ambassador at large for GOPAC, which is the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. Please welcome Akash Maharaj.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Your Honor, and everyone. I have to start off by saying that, unlike my two colleagues, I'm something of an improbable member of this panel in that I can claim relatively little expertise on Crown affairs, so I'm sorry. I'm professionally and personally absorbed in the business of nation building, and I see the monarchy through that lens. I have to tell you, it is an unsentimental perspective. If I thought it would serve the national interest, I would happily send Charles III on a post-coronation date with Madame Guillotine. But I'm not dusting off my tumbril because I've seen firsthand how Crown institutions nurture and can be nurtured by the plurality, the unity, and the justice of our societies. In my work with GOPAC, I can attest that Commonwealth realms and constitutional monarchies are, on average, the least corrupt states in the international system. It is because, in part, they separate splendor from government, they separate social prestige from political power, and they elevate loyalty to the sovereign above submission to political actors. In my work at the Munk School, I can say that constitutional monarchies are the best suited to sustaining pluralistic societies. There's no overstating the importance of an institution or an individual that has the reach to pass through our social divisions and to call us together, to enable us to appreciate one another, learn from one another, build mutual understanding, and envision a future together. And all of us are here in this room together from different generations and different walks of life because we have been summoned together by our Lieutenant Governor in the name of the Crown, and none of us has refused the call. And finally, I volunteer as a governor of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. And in that role, I've seen the power of the Crown as an instrument of decolonization, precisely because, historically, the Crown has been entwined with some of the worst crimes of colonialism. The Geographical Society was originally run by men in pith helmets who drew maps of other people's countries as a way of misappropriating their lands under the fiction of new discoveries. Today, the Society's honorary president is the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Many of our expeditions are Indigenous-led, and we are the chosen institution of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people when they came together to create the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, the acknowledged document of record of the Indigenous reality of the lands that compose our country. In my view, that is what total victory looks like, because if we choose to make the Crown our ally in the program of decolonization, then no colonial edifice has a chance of withstanding it. Thank you.
Thank you, Akash. So, this is our illustrious panel, and we have about 25 minutes together before we open the floor to your questions. We can continue on if need be and if desire be. But let me ask, Carolyn gave us much of the history, but I would like to spend a couple of minutes looking ahead to Saturday. Maybe a show of hands. Who's planning to get up at 5 o'clock to watch the ceremony? I'm gathering there'll be quite a few in this room. So indeed, and you'll be part of our coverage, as a matter of fact, on CBC Radio. We talked about the history. We'll see centuries-old traditions, pageantry, ritual. What are some of the key moments, some of the key symbols, again, some that we can watch for on Saturday?
Well, we'll be seeing some of the royal regalia. St. Edward's crown that was commissioned for Charles II in 1661 will be used for the crowning. And then we're going to see the imperial state crown that's there for state openings of Parliament that will be there towards the end of the ceremony. Something that's going to be very striking on Saturday is seeing the Queen Consort's regalia. We haven't had a crowning of a Queen Consort since Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 1937. So we're going to see the consort scepter with the dove that was developed for James II's consort, Mary of Modena, in 1685. So the regalia is going to be there. And there's going to be these key moments of the homage to the monarch, the crowning, the anointing, the recognition. And it's very striking that at this coronation, whereas in 1953 there was an emphasis on all of the dukes, starting with Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, paying homage to the new queen. What we're going to be seeing on Saturday is the public being encouraged to share in this moment and pledge their own loyalty to the crown in the context of the sovereign personifying the nation.
It's interesting because, yes, there will be countless nods to history,
Yes.
but we also know that the king has made some decisions to personalize the service. Akash, for example, the things that I've been talking about, the procession route is shorter, the guest list is smaller. There are some 400 young people who've been invited who represent various charities. Some of the other things, faith leaders will lead the first processions into Westminster Abbey, and that's the first time non-Protestant faith leaders have been given a role in the coronation. And we know that there'll be representatives from all of the realms where the king is head of state, flag bearers of each nation with the governors general, and also the prime ministers. So when I give you that list of the changes we'll see this time, how do you interpret that? What does it suggest to you about the king and his direction?
I think clearly the king understands that though he has inherited his crown, he still has to earn it. He has to demonstrate the relevance of the crown. And it's a difficult dance that every monarch has to play. On the one hand, he has to embody and hold fast to traditions and to the 1,000-year history of the institution. But he has to find ways to bring to bear those strengths to be relevant to the modern world. The world today is radically different from what it was in 1953. We are significantly more pluralistic, and we have a different perspective on our own history and the arc of time. I think that the king is alert to those realities, and he's trying to demonstrate that in the coronation itself is, he's already king. The coronation is a symbolic process, the anointing of the king. But he's trying to demonstrate that through the symbolism that he chooses for himself, that he's going to embody a set of values to which his subjects around the world can relate. It will be a difficult process. It always is for every monarch, and it is probably more difficult now than at any time in the past. But I think that he has demonstrated a desire to confront those issues head on in a way that is likely to make some of his colleagues nervous and uncomfortable, but I think is more likely to inspire confidence across the Commonwealth.
Some of these things I'd like to talk about in a little bit more detail ahead. But Nathan, I'd like to ask you too, mentioning the Queen's coronation, 1953, it was a very different society, it was a very different time. And the coronation in many ways was to introduce the world to this young queen and also to boost the morale coming out of the Second World War. Well, King Charles needs no royal introduction. We know him longest serving in the role of Prince of Wales. So what do you see as the purpose of this coronation?
I see it as the monarchy, as Akash alluded to or said, that the monarchy is it's an ancient institution. It goes back 1,000 years. but it's not a static institution. It has to develop to reflect the society in which it sits. And it's an international monarchy. He is the head of 15 different realms across the world, each with different needs. You're right, we don't need to be introduced to King Charles. We know King Charles. We've known him now for over 70 years. And so I think what we're seeing here is he's hitting the ground running, so to speak. He's showing us the type of king that he is, and that there's not going to be, in the words of the Princess Royal last night, there's not going to be any surprises, but yet his core values are there: the environment, bringing people together, the emphasis on youth, the work of the Prince's Trust, of providing a space to gather together in community, and the importance of ceremony too, which is something that I've really become in tune to through my interactions with Indigenous folks. That's something that I've really taught, and that's something that I believe that the King really gets. And I think that we're seeing that in this ceremony. There's this delicate balance, but you can tell a lot of thought has been put into it, and a lot of different aspects of the world are being reflected in that.
A very different world with a very different attitude. In Canada, we had quite a revealing survey just a couple of days ago that you perhaps heard about from Angus Reid. Got a great deal of national attention, and there were many eye-popping headlines from that. 60% of respondents opposed recognizing Charles as King of Canada. Only 28% of respondents had a favorable view. The vast majority have little or no interest in the coronation. So, Akash, again, you raised some of these points. What do you make of the survey results, and what do you think they say about Canadians' relationship with the monarchy now?
I think in Canada, as distinct from in the United Kingdom, the monarchy is significantly mediated through the choices of the government. King Charles, like all of our sovereigns, is in some ways the least free Canadian. He may not even enter the country without the permission of the Prime Minister. He may make no statement without the permission of the Prime Minister. And I think it is fair to say that the figures that we're seeing in that poll reflect a fact that many Prime Ministers over the past years have been highly ambivalent about the crown. They have been, in some ways, afraid that they are conscious of it symbolizing the past and have had difficulty envisioning how it can symbolize the future. I think as a result of that, those poll numbers suggest a population that is uncertain of how the crown relates to us. Ultimately, though, whether the crown survives in Canada or elsewhere will be the extent to which it holds up a mirror to us of our own values and reinforces those values. But that is fundamentally not up to the King. That is up to us as a society, because he can only act with the advice and consent of his government in Canada, and the government cannot lead and will not lead where the people will not follow. The real question to me isn't whether the crown can be relevant. The real question to me is whether we will make that choice as a nation.
Nathan, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, from an educator's point of view, I don't think many Canadians realize, but only Ontario teaches a course in civics at the high school level. It's taught at grade 10, and it's a half-credit course. And there's only 4 or 5 provinces right now that mandate a credit in Canadian history in order to get a high school diploma. And so I think a big part of that is our lack of understanding of our own history and how our democracy works. In my own classroom, I get confronted with this in treaty studies and in civics and even in our own Canadian history, that when we approach the Crown, when we are discussing the Crown, for most of my students, if not all, it's for the first time. A great friend of mine said that what settler Canadians need to realize, they need to answer the question of what is the Crown? And I don't think that that is a conversation that many Canadians are having, and it's one that we need to have. We need to understand its role in our society. It touches really every aspect of our democracy, both in treaty and within our democratic and legal traditions. And I think when we've done that, then we're ready for a poll to decide on whether it is we want to maintain that institution or not.
Carolyn, let me bring in this discussion to you, because Nathan raising what is the crown. You know, again, as we look to the poll, it was pretty revealing in that the majority of the respondents do not want the country to continue as a constitutional monarchy for generations to come. And a full 88% wanted an opening of that constitutional can of worms to look at the whole process of disengaging or to break from the monarchy. That's something that people think would be, or experts say would be, the chances are none to zero because of the difficulty of all of that. Can you just explain to what degree it is enshrined, it is embedded
Yes.
in our institutions and indeed in the Constitution?
Sometimes when we see in the Commonwealth, one Commonwealth realm transitioning to becoming a republic within the Commonwealth, it may seem as though all the other Commonwealth nations can do the same thing. But it's important to keep in mind these are all independent countries with distinct crowns that share a monarch, but they have their own historical relationships with the crown. So in Barbados, for instance, it was simply a matter of a 2/3 vote in the legislature. That is not the case in Canada. Changes to the office of the Queen require the consent of all 10 provinces, and all 10 provinces very rarely agree on anything. And it's difficult to imagine, for instance, Prince Edward Island voting to abolish the monarchy. So all 10 provinces would have to be on the same page. And then with constitutional change, likely they would want to see other changes as well. The House of Commons and the Senate would need to agree. And with there being treaties between the Crown and Indigenous peoples, they would certainly need to be consulted as well. And so the question would arise as to what would the new system of government be. And this is often where discussions of a transition from constitutional monarchy to republic become very complicated, as opponents of the monarchy don't necessarily agree on what an alternative would look like. And the more you research the Crown, the more you see how embedded it is in the fabric of different aspects of Canadian politics and law and society. So in Canada, it would be a very complicated process, and it seems unlikely that any politician would stake their career on a transition of this kind. Many Canadians, even those who don't necessarily vocally support the monarchy, have the view that this is the system we have, and it's a system that continues to work and function, so why reopen the matter? But over the course of the 21st century, it's possible that those views may change over time.
See, and I want to look to that in the future, but since Carolyn raised treaty, let me come back to you, Nathan, on that, and help us understand what is the nature of the Crown-Indigenous relationship historically? What is the view that you have of King Charles III, how he may change that relationship, and what this may all mean for reconciliation? This may be a long answer, but that's a lot. I've really triple-barreled that one,
Right.
but it is all tied together.
Yeah. From what I've learned, the oldest Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationship on this continent is with the King. It's called the Silver Covenant Chain, and it was established in the 1600s, and it's still relevant today. When Her Honor visits different Indigenous nations, she is relevant because she represents the King, not jurisdiction, not federal government, provincial. It's because of her relationship with the King, and that means something to Indigenous people. And there's layers of that because there are multiple different nations and different territories and treaties and different types of relationships. So, and traditionally speaking, Canada has over the past 2 centuries unilaterally altered those relationships without consent of Indigenous partners. So any type of a discussion on the Constitution of Canada that does not involve Indigenous people actually furthers that goal of colonization. As Akesh talked about, this idea of decolonization or uncolonizing, to actually remove the Crown without the consent of Indigenous folks would actually be part of that colonization. Those original relationships, as their foundation, these foundational relationships, were bound with the Crown centuries before Canada even existed. So I think that's kind of the starting point where we have to begin that conversation before we can even go beyond that.
Did you want to add something to that, Carolyn?
Well, we see this historic relationship that evolves over time, and it's interesting to see that as early as 1710, Mohawk leaders, the 4 kings of Canada, visiting with Queen Anne, and there being particular music that was commissioned for their visit to London. So as Nathan has discussed, there is this very long and historic relationship that continues to to be a living entity that evolves over time.
And King Charles has mentioned he sees the importance of reconciliation. He sees the need for a renewed relationship. We just haven't seen what form that's going to take, Nathan.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot the second part of your question there. That's right. The first thing that the king said after he assumed the throne, after the death of his mother, is he gathered the different high commissioners of the different realms of which he's head of state together. And our High Commissioner is Ralph Goodale, and he gave an interview shortly after that meeting, and he said that the first thing that the king mentioned was reconciliation, and that he wanted to be part of that. And as Akesh wisely mentioned, so we have a king who wants to do these things, who wants to act, who wants to engage with Indigenous people. The second piece to that critical piece, is the government now has to action that, has to give that advice and create that space, because under our democracy of responsible government, the king can only do so much. But if the government there provides that advice, I think some pretty extraordinary things could be done. And the king is wanting to do that. He has sent that message. There was a wonderful interview between him and Margaret Atwood just last year on BBC4. You can Google it, but they were talking, and the king admitted that throughout COVID, he actually was spending a lot of time talking with Indigenous leaders right across Canada because he was stuck at home, and he wanted to talk about Indigenous perspectives on climate change and what could be done. And he said that the answer is in that knowledge. So we have someone who is engaging.
Speaking of interviews, all three of you have used the word relevance tonight. Last night, if you were watching The National, Adrienne Arsenault interviewed Princess Anne, and it was very revealing, but one of the exchanges spoke to just that point, Akash. Princess Anne, you know, in the poll that we have again coming back to Angus Reid, so many of the respondents felt the monarchy reflects outdated values. It is not relevant to daily life. And Princess Anne acknowledged that to a degree in the interview last night. Adrienne asked, are there conversations about relevance? And the princess answered, there will be everywhere. This is a quote. It's not a conversation that I would necessarily have, but I think it's perfectly true that it is a moment where you need to have that discussion. So inviting a discussion of the relevancy of the monarchy and of the crown of the royal family in modern society and our daily life. Akash, what is the relevance discussion we need to be having at this moment?
You know, the crown is, as we would all agree, a symbol. The question then is, what does it symbolize? The deeper question behind that really is, who and what are we as a society? Across the Commonwealth, I would argue that Canada is the most diverse society. There is no other Commonwealth realm that has such a variety of people from such a variety of backgrounds. And demographically in Canada, we have not had replacement level fertility since 1971. So for the better part of half a century, for more than half a century, our sustainability as a nation has been based entirely on immigration. And that gives our country a very rich texture. It means that we have a wealth of assets and backgrounds to draw on. But pluralism is hard work. Being able to have a society that is both pluralistic and unified is only possible if we are able to have meaningful conversations with one another about what are the shared values that bind us together and define us as a nature. What is the nature of a social contract in a country like Canada? And I do believe that the role of the Crown is to enable those conversations. Many of our viceroys, our lieutenant governors, some of our governors generals have most excelled when they have led not by telling Canadians where we ought to go, but by bringing us together to start the journey. By bringing us together even when we disagree, especially when we disagree, to have the kinds of conversations about who are we, what do we want to do, who are we and who is not we, and what are the boundaries between our traditional liberalism as a society and the choices of our country as our country's complexion changes.
So on that very point, it is the nature of the change in complexion. This is a much larger, much stronger, much richer, far more diverse country now than it was at the last coronation. And it is for that reason specifically that many people who admired the Queen so ardently now think it's time to break from the monarchy.
I think that that is based on an idea that the monarch should personally embody the diversity of our country. That is impossible. It's impossible for any one person to personally have all the qualities that make up our country. The most that one person can do is enable us to come together to have those conversations. And I do think that our new king has shown a commitment to that. But as importantly, the Crown apparatus that is part of the fabric of our country has shown a commitment to that. The hard question that I think that people shy away from, it is easy to say, King Charles is nothing like me, because King Charles is nothing like me. He is nothing like anyone in this room. But the real question is, who am I? Who are we as a society? I think it is possible to have that conversation through the Crown precisely because there is distance and there is history. It would be a mistake to expect any head of government to be able to be a perfect mirror of a society as diverse as ours. But it would be a loss to throw away the one institution that has had and has demonstrated capacity to bring together people who are different to have those conversations.
Again, to quote Princess Anne, I would underline that the monarchy provides with the Constitution a degree of long-term stability that is quite hard to come by any other way, speaking to the point that you just made. So, apart from wholesale change and abandoning the system of constitutional monarchy, do you foresee, Carolyn, some of the incremental changes that people are talking about now? No longer having to swear an oath of allegiance to the king, for example. No longer having to sing God Save the King at ceremonies. Not having the king's picture on Canadian currency. Do you think these would be things that would be practical? That these might be something that we might see in this country in the future? Would they satisfy those who want to make sure that Canada has a greater degree of autonomy and maturity and independence?
Well, I think when a long and successful reign comes to an end, it can be difficult to imagine anyone else in that role and for there to be changes to familiar imagery. So when Queen Victoria passed away in 1901 and Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, or future Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, remembered his father being in tears and saying that it was the end of an era, Canada stuck with the Victoria Day holiday. They didn't switch to Edward VII's more unseasonable November birthday, that the holiday remained in May in order to honor Queen Victoria's role, not just as a constitutional monarch, but as a mother of Confederation who had brought together many fathers of Confederation with different views. So it certainly seems likely that not everything will change, whether it's currency or imagery. I think a greater challenge in terms of visibility in the 21st century is that we're seeing fewer working members of the royal family. The beginning of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, she recruited her cousins to take on roles. Her cousin, the Duke of Kent, not only undertook overseas tours, but gave out the trophies at Wimbledon for 50 years. So there was a big extended royal family traveling, undertaking public engagements, and becoming attached to Canadian military regiments and institutions. Now there's a much smaller working royal family, and so there's going to be an evolution of the relationship between members of the royal family with the Commonwealth realms, as it may be a challenge to be engaged with quite so many institutions and undertake so many tours. So I think some of the virtual engagements that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, that may well continue going forward, as there's going to be a small working core of members of the royal family spreading themselves quite thin.
You mentioned the Commonwealth. Listen, if you have questions, now would be a good time. Maybe if you want to go to your QR codes and submit those, I've got my iPad ready to go, and I'll certainly bring them into the conversation now. But Nathan, let me bring up the Commonwealth to you, because this is where we've seen, I mean, certainly in Australia, to a lesser degree here, but within the Commonwealth nations, we've seen the very vigorous debate over historic atrocities, over reparations, over slavery, over colonialism. What do you see as the Commonwealth's future, and how does that figure into, a modern or a modernized monarchy?
The Commonwealth, the more I learn about the Commonwealth, it really is a pretty remarkable organization, because it continues to grow and evolve and develop. It's now at 56 nations, and now we're actually having nations that are joining it that have no connection to the British Empire or British colonization. It's a leader in education, in dialogue, and in good governance practices, and also on the environmental front, particularly for small states, the small island states, I think, right off the bat. And we've seen with the King, and we're seeing with this coronation ceremony, that the Commonwealth remains a relevant part of his vision for the future. So I think, again, as an arena of conversation, the Commonwealth is a really important institution. And it's also voluntary too, which I think is really quite remarkable. It's not a military alliance, it's not a political alliance. It's a community of people together trying to solve the world's problems. And that really is a metaphor for the Crown itself, I think, and particularly the Crown that we're seeing coming together under Charles III.
Thank you for these questions. They're being curated, and I'm just going to be the conduit to our panelists. Maybe Akash, you can pick up from this point in that there are questions about the Commonwealth. Some countries are marking the coronation by reevaluating their relationship with the Crown. And again, to the point of the Commonwealth, does the shrinking Commonwealth represent post-colonial nation building, or does it risk inflaming political tensions?
You know, the Commonwealth is made up, 2/3 of the states of the Commonwealth are already republics. Only about 1/3 of the Commonwealth states are Commonwealth realms, that is, states where Charles III is the king. It is possible, therefore, to imagine a Commonwealth that will carry on irrespective of the choice of the individual states about whether they wish to remain monarchies or not. What I would say, though, is that, yes, it is absolutely healthy that, especially at this juncture, that countries take the time to ask themselves difficult questions, to evaluate their place in the international system and the sorts of values that bind them together. What I would say, though, is that I've often seen the symbolism of the Crown being used as a pretext to rush for easy answers. There's no denying that the Crown is fundamentally entwined with slavery. It always has been. The Crown was at the center of the Anglo-American slave trade. The United States is a republic. I don't think there's anyone who would argue that it has been better able to deal with the history or the legacy of slavery because it is a republic. The Commonwealth states that now wrestle with those questions, I can understand why the eye is drawn to the Crown. But it would be a mistake to believe that shedding the Crown will shed the legacy of those issues. I would argue that indeed that the institutions that were most enmeshed with the crimes of colonialism bear the greatest responsibility for being part of the solution, and indeed have the greatest power to be part of the solution. A king who stands up and makes a statement about the crimes of slavery is far more powerful than a president who can claim no connection to the people who committed those crimes. Moreover, again, I go back to the idea of us all being pluralistic societies. We cannot hope to triumph as societies if we view our success as triumphing over one another or over the past. We have to find ways to triumph together if we are to triumph at all. And yes, there are people who will say that the history of the Crown is so tainted that it cannot be redeemed. If that is the case, then we are also implicitly saying our own countries that are built on these institutions are so tainted that they too cannot be redeemed. I have to believe that the Crown can redeem itself because I wish to believe that Canada can redeem itself.
It's interesting. This week, again, just from a news perspective, the King acknowledged some research which had been done, some investigative work by The Guardian, looking into the family background and tracing things directly back to a 17th century plantation in Virginia, I do believe, and allowing for further research, fostering that, encouraging that, and wanting to speak to that. So again, the kind of openness that Nathan, you spoke to, again, we don't know where this will lead or what will ultimately come from it, but at least in the spirit of openness, the words being uttered now. You wanted to add to that, Nathan, before we move on.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build on that and say that the Crown is remembrancer. I appreciate, as a teacher of history, that we have an institution that causes us to constantly reflect on our history. Canada often is presented as a country that is always looking forward, and when that happens, we tend not to look at our history behind us, and that can be a very dangerous thing. So I appreciate that there is an institution that is because it reflects our society and it reflects the societies of the past, is constantly having to deal with that history. If we look at this space right here, this is a space that's been created in conversation, and it thinks in long term. The Crown always must think in long term. Politicians don't think in long term. They think in 4-year election cycles. And so that is a very different way of managing
That's
the
something
country.
that's central to Carolyn's thinking too.
Yes, I think that one of the ways in which the royal family will remain relevant in the 21st century is by positioning themselves as advocates for bringing people together to address issues that will take generations to solve. And so we see, for instance, Prince Philip's role when he was patron of the World Wildlife Fund, and now King Charles III, and he has had this lifelong advocacy for organic farming and sustainable development. Prince William speaking on the preservation of endangered species. So there are many issues that are often conceived of as unfolding within shorter election cycles. And in the context of the Crown, the royal family can place itself in a position of bringing people together to address these long-term issues that will take generations to address.
Nathan, someone referring to something you said earlier in our conversation, if the government creates the space on the topic of reconciliation,
Right.
some pretty incredible things could be done.
Yep.
What are those things? This is the question. Thank you from the audience. And what is the best scenario, again, in keeping with the fact that there's a new king?
So the last time that the king was in the country was last summer, and it was a whistle-stop tour of less than 3 days. And a theme of that tour was reconciliation, of meeting with Indigenous folks. And I was in Yellowknife for the last portion of that. And the time that was allotted for the then Prince of Wales to meet with Indigenous folks was 4 hours. And so the king is not in control of his agenda. That would be under the control of the Department of Canadian Heritage and the Prime Minister's office. So creating that space means creating that time, creating time for treaty partners to meet, in meaningful ways, not in a 4-hour window. So I think opportunities like that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action, one of them asks for a royal proclamation of reconciliation. So what does that look like? What does that mean? So we would need to have a meaningful conversation, and the king would have to be a part of that because it's a royal proclamation. So these are the things that I'm talking about, but that requires the government to move forward with that agenda.
Okay. Nathan, this one I'll put to you first of all. It's from someone in the audience who's an immigrant from a developing country that was colonized by the British, and we've been speaking with you at length. Sorry, I meant to Akash. I apologize. There are contested feelings when it comes to the monarchy. So, Akash, how do you view that? When you analyze the Crown, when you think on the Crown, how do you figure that all through that lens?
I think it's absolutely appropriate. The history of the Crown is checkered, as the history of individuals and nations are checkered. The question is, how can we be just in our own time? There's no doubt in my mind that there are some countries, some Commonwealth realms, who will become republics over the next few years. I think the scars in those nations run too deep, and the capacity of the Crown to be a catalyst, an instrument for change, probably is not strong enough and is not being nurtured by local political actors. But there are other countries where that is a possibility, and I think Canada is one of them. We are ultimately, all of us as human beings, creatures of emotion before we are creatures of reason. And as a result, the capacity of institutions that have deep histories to stir deep waters within ourselves has no equal in the political process. As I mentioned, we're here because our Lieutenant Governor has called us together. I'm certain that if Prime Minister Trudeau had issued the same invitation, there are people in this room who would have declined it because of their views on him and his policies. If Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre had issued that invitation, other people would have declined it for the same dynamic. We need to have institutions that are able to rise above the divisions within our society, and indeed institutions that have the ability to rise above the crimes and the wrong of the past. It is fundamentally, we think about the Crown and we think about the past, and that is appropriate because the past spreads out so far behind us. But my view is that the Crown is an instrument for the future. It is not, it would not be useful if it were simply an artifact or a fossil of a bygone age. But whether we use it to its full potential is up to us and up to our political actors, and they in turn will respond to the question of whether we are looking for someone to blame or someone to help us to the next stage in our future.
Akash, that's a wonderful closing thought from you, I think, as our time approaches to the end. Thank you for the questions. I will call you in just a second, Sal, but Akash has just given his summation, which I think was so apropos. Can I ask you, Carolyn, and you, Nathan, just for a couple of closing comments, what are your expectations for the reign of King Charles?
I think we're going to see King Charles III being very active in his reign. He was out meeting the public in front of Buckingham Palace the day after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, at a time when many people would have understood if he had needed more private time. So I think we are going to see King Charles III being very active and connecting with people of all walks of life and finding ways to bring them together so that they can share ideas to address the 21st century's challenges.
And Nathan, that question to you as well to conclude tonight.
I think if we look at the man Charles as head of state, he really is tailor-made for Canada when we look at his role in the environment, his engagement with Indigenous people, the work of the Prince's Trust, both in this country and in other countries as well, and with young people. He's there for the taking, but it depends on Canada to engage with that institution. We have an institution that has worked very well for this country, and there's so much potential for Canada moving forward in the future, and the Crown has a part to play in that, and I hope that we take this moment and we use that potential.
Would you join me? I know there'll be formal thanks to come, but from my perspective, please join in to Nathan and to Akash and to Carolyn for sharing that incredible knowledge and perspective and expertise and really illuminating the days to come and the years to come as we embark at this, as I said, this critical juncture in our history. Sal, would you like to come back? Shall I bring Sal back? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and our panelists for sharing your thoughts and knowledge with us today. As a club of record, all Empire Club of Canada events are available to watch and listen to on demand on our website. The recording of this event will be available shortly, and everyone registered will receive an email with the link. Please rise as you are able for the singing of the national anthem and the exit of our honored Lieutenant Governor. Thank you. Thank you. You may be seated. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today. We invite you to join us downstairs for the dinner service, and so Those seated at tables 9 and 10 will turn left, while those seated at tables 1 through 8 will turn to the right. If you need any assistance finding your seat, Her Honor's aide-de-camps will be available to assist. I ask that the Table 1 head table guests remain in this music room for a photo opportunity. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.